I am Sabrina, and I am 32 years old. Exactly 3 weeks ago, my father stood up and loudly called me a loser in front of 50 elite guests at his extravagant Founders' Day celebration. He absolutely did not lean in and whisper the insult discreetly. He did not politely pull me aside into a private hallway to express his disappointment. He proudly stood at the absolute head of a massive, custom mahogany dining table, a piece of furniture worth significantly more than my entire annual salary, raised his expensive crystal flute of imported Chateau Margaux, and loudly announced to every single assembled blood relative, wealthy business partner, and invited Forbes journalist in the room, I am incredibly proud of every single one of my successful children, with the glaring exception of the absolute failure sitting at the far end of this table. The entire room erupted into genuine laughter. My older brother actually clapped his hands in amusement. My stepmother offered a slow, venomous smile, looking exactly as if she had been patiently waiting 27 long years for this specific moment of public execution. But I did not burst into tears. I did not run out of the room in shame. Instead, I slowly stood up to my full height, walked the length of the silent room directly to where my father sat, and calmly placed a crisp, plain white envelope directly onto his pristine porcelain plate. "A special gift just for you, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silence. "Happy Founders Day." And then I simply turned on my heel and walked out the door. When he finally ripped open that white envelope, the agonizing scream that tore from his throat violently echoed through all 4 stories of that massive mansion. Before I reveal exactly what devastating truth was hiding inside that envelope, please take a quiet moment to settle in. If you find yourself drawn to stories of exposing deep-rooted family toxicity and executing the ultimate, flawless karma, I invite you to stay and listen. And if you are tuning in from somewhere out there in the world, please drop a comment letting me know your current location and the time on your clock. I always love knowing where my community of survivors is resting right now. Now, let me drag you back exactly 2 months earlier to the damp, rainy afternoon when my Aunt Beatrice quietly handed me a locked, wooden cedar box that my deceased mother had kept desperately hidden in the shadows for 27 years. The sprawling Sterling estate sits aggressively on 15 manicured acres in the wealthiest enclave of the state. It boasts 4 towering stories of flawless, imposing neoclassical architecture, massive wrought iron security gates, and a long, sweeping driveway perfectly lined with mature, imported weeping willows. Elite architecture magazines have featured the property on 3 separate occasions, breathlessly calling it a masterpiece of understated generational wealth. I personally just called it a beautifully landscaped, maximum security prison. My father, Arthur Sterling, built his massive commercial development empire completely from the dirt up. Or, at least, that is the polished, inspiring narrative he loudly peddles to anyone holding a microphone at high society charity galas. The actual, unvarnished truth is significantly messier, heavily involving my late mother's ancestral land rights and deep political connections that he would strongly prefer to permanently erase from history. But we will get to the ugly mechanics of that transaction a bit later. Growing up trapped inside those cold, marble walls, I learned incredibly quickly exactly where I fell in the rigid Sterling family hierarchy. Sitting comfortably at the absolute peak was Julian, my older brother. He is 35 years old, meticulously groomed since the day he took his first steps to eventually inherit the corporate throne. He drives an obscenely loud, custom imported sports car, and I do not think I have ever seen him wear the same designer silk tie twice in a single year. He is my father's undeniable golden child, his perfect, arrogant mirror image. Positioned comfortably just beneath him is Vanessa, my younger half-sister. She is 27, the pampered daughter of my stepmother, Victoria. Vanessa currently holds the fabricated title of Senior Director of Marketing at Sterling Global Holdings, a lavish 6-figure title she successfully earned entirely by simply existing and breathing oxygen. She spends her days aggressively posting photographs of her exotic vacations and limited edition handbags on social media, unironically referring to her endless consumerism as curating her personal brand. And then, dragging at the absolute, murky bottom of the barrel, there is me, Sabrina, the dedicated public school educator, the disappointing daughter who drives a rattling, decade-old reliable sedan and proudly purchases her professional wardrobe off the clearance racks at discount department stores. The stubborn woman who consciously, deliberately chose a life of helping marginalized children over a life of ruthlessly accumulating capital, which, when directly translated into the native Sterling family language, equates to being a complete, utter, humiliating disappointment to the bloodline. Every single time I am forced to visit the grand estate, I instinctively park my beat-up sedan around the back corner of the property, completely hidden behind the massive stone gardener's shed. Not because anyone ever explicitly gave me an order to do so. I park it there because the very first time I naively parked in the grand, circular front driveway, Julian laughed so incredibly hard he literally choked on his morning espresso. "Did you actually take a cheap rideshare service to get here in that rolling dumpster?" he had asked, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. "Or is that an unfortunate rental car? God, please tell me it is just a temporary rental." It was absolutely not a rental. It was the only significant piece of property I owned completely free and clear of debt, and I was incredibly proud of it. But I quickly learned that inside that specific house, personal pride meant absolutely nothing unless it was heavily tethered to a massive price tag. The formal invitation to the Founders' Day event arrived exactly 3 weeks prior to the date. It was not delivered via an elegant paper invitation in the mail, but rather delivered as a strict, verbal mandate by Victoria herself via a scheduled video conference call. My stepmother popped onto my laptop screen, wearing a flawless, cream-colored designer jacket, her wrist heavily adorned with her signature, solid gold designer bangle, the exorbitant gift Arthur had purchased for their 10-year wedding anniversary. Her smile was incredibly perfect, heavily practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. It was the exact, specific type of clinical smile that made you feel as though you were being aggressively interrogated by human resources rather than being invited to a family gathering. "Sabrina, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I sincerely hope I am not interrupting your work." The microscopic, deliberate pause right before she said the word work was entirely intentional. It always was. "Not at all, Victoria," I replied, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. "What exactly is going on?" "Well, as I am sure you are already well aware, your father is formally receiving the prestigious Visionary Builder of the Year award from the State Commerce Committee next month. We are hosting a massive, lavish celebration here at the estate. Very exclusive, highly intimate. Just the immediate family and a few dozen of his most vital corporate investors." She paused, allowing the heavy, oppressive weight of the word intimate to fully settle into my brain. "Naturally, we desperately need you to be present for the photos." Naturally. She used the word need, conspicuously avoiding the word want. "The regional press will be attending the event," she continued smoothly, reaching up to adjust an entirely invisible, non-existent strand of blonde hair. "Several major business publications are sending their premier photographers. It is absolutely imperative that we present a completely unified, flawless, loving family front to the media." And there it was. The absolute, unvarnished truth. I was absolutely not being invited to this party because they genuinely missed my presence or because they wanted to celebrate with me. I was being strictly summoned because an empty chair at the table would inevitably raise uncomfortable questions from journalists. Sabrina Sterling, the mysteriously absent, estranged daughter. That specific phrase would make for a highly distracting, negative headline. But Sabrina Sterling, standing quietly and obediently in the blurred background, while her powerful father collected yet another golden trophy. That was perfectly acceptable set dressing. "Of course I will attend," I said, ruthlessly keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I will absolutely be there." "Wonderful." Her artificial smile instantly widened, but her sharp eyes remained as cold and dead as a frozen lake. "Oh, and Sabrina, darling, please do try your absolute best to dress appropriately for the occasion. Your father's entire public reputation is on the line here." The video call abruptly terminated before I could even draw breath to respond. I sat alone in my small apartment and stared at my dark computer screen for a very long time. I painfully remembered all the dozens of other times Victoria had snidely reminded me to dress appropriately, to speak appropriately, to simply exist appropriately within their orbit. She was absolutely not inviting me to a joyous family celebration. She was actively summoning me to perform my required role as the grateful, submissive prop. I feel compelled to pause and explain exactly why I kept foolishly returning to that house for so many years. When I was 10 years old, I won first place in a massive, district-wide school essay writing competition. The assigned topic was simply titled "My Ultimate Hero," while other children wrote about famous athletes or historical presidents. I wrote entirely about my mother. I wrote about how she used to sit on the edge of my bed and read me complex, beautiful stories every single night. I wrote about how her skin always smelled faintly of blooming jasmine flowers and ancient, dusty library books. I wrote about how she used to fiercely hug me and whisper that I was the absolute greatest gift the universe had ever given her. My mother had been dead for 5 long years by the time I wrote that essay, but the physical act of writing down those memories made her spirit feel incredibly close and real to me again. I ran all the way home from the bus stop that afternoon, fiercely clutching that cheap paper certificate to my chest as if it were constructed of solid, priceless gold. I found my father sitting in his dark, oppressive study, aggressively reviewing thick legal contracts. I burst through the heavy mahogany doors, completely breathless with excitement. "Daddy, I won!" I proudly shouted. "First place in the entire school district." He did not even bother to look up from his glowing laptop screen. "Writing," he stated flatly, his voice dripping with profound boredom. "And exactly how much money does writing little stories generate in the real world, Sabrina?" I stood frozen on the Persian rug, the edges of my proud certificate instantly wilting in my sweaty hands. I honestly don't know, Daddy. I just thought you would be Julian." My father suddenly bellowed, his voice echoing down the hallway, completely cutting me off. "Julian scored 3 massive goals in his elite soccer tournament this afternoon. Now that is the exact kind of tangible achievement that actually matters in this house. Ruthless teamwork, fierce competition, total victory." Julian, who was 13 years old and already expertly wearing the arrogant, superior smirk he would perfect over the next 2 decades, lazily appeared in the doorway. "Yeah, little sister," Julian sneered down at me. "Maybe you should just quietly stick to cheering for the winners from the sidelines." Later that exact same night, I quietly tore my first place certificate into 100 tiny shreds and cried myself to sleep in the dark. But I distinctly remember one specific, highly crucial thing from that awful evening. My grandmother Evelyn, Arthur's own mother, quietly found me sobbing in my room long after the house had gone to sleep. She was the absolute only source of genuine human warmth in that freezing, miserable house. She gently pulled my shaking body into her frail arms and whispered something into my hair that I completely failed to comprehend at the time. "You look so incredibly, beautifully much like your mother, my sweet girl," she whispered fiercely. "You look exactly like Margaret." She said the words like they were a highly dangerous secret, like they were a sacred prayer. I didn't fully understand then exactly why those specific Words carried such immense, crushing weight. I absolutely understand it now. If the sprawling Sterling estate was a maximum security prison, Aunt Beatrice's rustic cottage located deep in the rural mountains was its exact polar opposite. Beatrice Thorne was my late mother's younger sister. She was the absolute only living, breathing connection I still possessed to Margaret Thorne the vibrant woman who had physically given birth to me and who had tragically died when I was only 5 years old. While the Sterling family lived an existence suffocated by cold marble and dark mahogany, Beatrice lived in a tiny, drafty, sunlit farmhouse entirely surrounded by massive, ancient maple trees and towering, chaotic stacks of secondhand literature. She had proudly worked as a public librarian for over 30 years. Her ultimate idea of wild luxury was purchasing a brand new, high-quality reading lamp. I loved her fiercely with every fiber of my being. Every single year on my birthday, completely without fail, Beatrice mailed me a physical, handwritten card. Not a sterile text message, not a quick email. A real, heavy paper card, containing delicate, pressed flowers from her own garden, filled with words that actually made me feel seen and valued as a human being. Happy birthday to my absolute favorite niece in the world, she would write in her elegant cursive. Your mother would be so incredibly, fiercely proud of the brilliant woman you are rapidly becoming. She was the absolute only person in my entire life who was brave enough to speak my mother's name out loud. We talked on the phone for hours every few weeks. I would exhaustedly complain about the suffocating bureaucracy of public school administration, and she would enthusiastically recommend obscure, brilliant novels I had never even heard of. Our long conversations were incredibly easy, free-flowing, and entirely uncomplicated. They were absolutely nothing like the terrifying, anxiety-inducing verbal minefields of the Sterling family Friday dinners. But looking back, there was always something heavy that Beatrice was consciously holding back from me. A slight, nervous hesitation in her voice whenever I accidentally brought up Arthur's name. A careful, incredibly strategic deflection whenever I pressed her for deeper details about my mother's mysterious past. Someday soon, she would always gently promise me, her tone turning serious. When you are finally strong enough and completely ready, I have something incredibly important I need to physically show you. Something Margaret explicitly wanted you to possess. Ready for what exactly? I would always ask. You will inherently know when the time is right, she would reply cryptically. I never aggressively pushed her for answers. Beatrice was absolutely not the type of woman to maliciously withhold information without a profoundly good reason. And a dark, quiet part of my soul, I think, was genuinely terrified of exactly what I might find if I dug too deep. But that lingering fear was about to become entirely irrelevant. Because exactly 2 months before the infamous Founders' Day disaster, I drove up to the mountains for my spring break vacation, and Beatrice finally, decisively concluded that I was ready. But before we get to that revelation, I urgently need to tell you about the Friday night dinners. Every single Friday evening, completely without exception, the Sterling family was mandated to gather around a massive, 20-seat, solid oak dining table that Arthur had obnoxiously imported from a crumbling, historic estate in Europe. Heavy lead crystal glasses, dripping expensive beeswax candles, vintages of imported wine that literally cost significantly more than my entire monthly grocery budget. The atmosphere was explicitly designed to feel aristocratic and elegant. Instead, it always felt exactly like a brutal, unforgiving corporate performance review. The toxic ritual was identical every single week. Arthur would sit aggressively at the absolute head of the massive table, slowly swirling his dark wine, looking exactly like a ruthless tribunal judge preparing to deliver devastating verdicts to the condemned. Victoria would perch rigidly right beside him, exhibiting flawless, terrifying posture, aggressively monitoring everyone's micro-expressions and behavior like a starving hawk dressed in expensive couture. And then, the aggressive interrogation would commence. Julian, Arthur, demanded sharply during the very last miserable dinner I attended before my trip to the mountains. Give me a full, detailed report on the massive coastal development acquisition. Julian instantly straightened his spine, preening under the spotlight. We officially closed the entire deal yesterday afternoon, Dad. $8.4 million in pure profit. Their pathetic lawyers attempted to aggressively lowball our initial offer, but I ruthlessly held the line and crushed them. That is exactly my boy. Arthur beamed with genuine, unfiltered pride, raising his crystal glass high into the air. To Julian's absolute victory. To Julian. The entire table obediently echoed in unison like a trained choir. Vanessa, Arthur barked, pivoting his attention. How exactly is the massive corporate rebranding initiative progressing? Significantly ahead of the projected schedule. Vanessa enthusiastically flipped, her perfectly highlighted hair over her shoulder. The aggressive new multimedia campaign officially launches globally next month. Several premier financial magazines are already begging to feature our new aesthetic on their covers. Excellent work. To Vanessa's undeniable success. To Vanessa, the table chanted. Again. And then, the massive dining room fell completely, suffocatingly silent. Arthur's cold, dead gaze slowly, agonizingly slid down the length of the table, until it finally locked onto me. Sabrina, he sighed, saying my name as if the simple act of pronouncing the syllables was a physically exhausting chore. Do you happen to have absolutely anything of actual value to report to this family? I slowly, deliberately set my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. Actually, yes, I do. One of my most dedicated senior students, a brilliant young girl who comes from an incredibly violent, unstable home environment, just received her official acceptance letter to the State University on a complete, full-ride academic scholarship. I have been aggressively, privately tutoring her after hours for over 2 years to make this happen. I foolishly expected something. A polite nod. A brief, hollow acknowledgement of the achievement. Instead, Julian let out a loud, wet, disgusting snort of derision. And exactly what massive financial kickback do you personally get out of that little charity project, Sabrina? A $20 gift card to a coffee shop? Arthur didn't even bother to offer a fake smile. So, absolutely nothing. That financially or socially benefits the Sterling family legacy as per your usual standard. Victoria gently patted his arm, offering a sickeningly sweet, venomous smile. Please do not be entirely too harsh on her, darling. We must accept that some fragile people are simply not biologically built for the rigors of true success. I gripped my linen napkin under the table so hard my knuckles turned white, and I remained completely silent. Because remaining silent was exactly what I had been systematically abused and trained to do for decades. Later that exact same night, long after the excruciating dinner had finally concluded, I quietly excused myself to use the restroom. The small, unassuming guest bathroom located on the first floor, naturally. Victoria had made it incredibly, violently clear years ago that the luxurious, primary family bathrooms upstairs were strictly reserved for actual, contributing family members. I was quietly walking back down the long, shadowed hallway, passing the entrance to the glass conservatory, when I suddenly heard her voice. Victoria was speaking frantically on her cell phone, her back turned completely toward the doorway. She had absolutely no idea I was standing in the shadows. Honestly, Beatrice, the entire situation is completely, utterly exhausting. Victoria hissed into the phone, letting out a sharp, cruel laugh. Having to constantly pretend to tolerate her pathetic, sad existence every single week is draining my energy. A brief pause as she listened. No, of course she doesn't suspect a single thing. She is entirely too desperate, too pathetic, and too starved for Arthur's impossible approval to clearly see the massive trap that is sitting right in front of her face. I froze dead in my tracks, my entire body turning to ice. The master plan is incredibly simple and elegant, Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, vicious whisper. Arthur has been aggressively itching to, permanently, legally cut her off from the estate for years. He just desperately needs a highly public, completely undeniable justification to do it cleanly. Something that explicitly makes her look like the unstable, chaotic problem to the outside world. Once she publicly embarrasses herself badly enough in front of the right people, she will completely break down and leave entirely on her own accord. No messy, dramatic family confrontations. Absolutely no complicated, drawn-out inheritance, legal disputes in the future. Just permanently, quietly gone. My heart was pounding so violently in my ears I thought it might rupture my eardrums. The upcoming Founders' Day Gala is the absolute perfect, flawless stage for the execution, Victoria sneered. All of those highly influential people watching her every move. All of that suffocating, elite social pressure. If Arthur ruthlessly pushes her hard enough, she will absolutely, catastrophically crack. And then we will finally, permanently be rid of the parasite. I pressed my entire body flat against the cold plaster wall, violently holding my breath, absolutely terrified to make a sound. But then, the ancient hardwood floorboard violently creaked loudly beneath my shifting weight. Victoria whipped around incredibly fast, her eyes wide. Our eyes instantly locked. For a terrifying split second, a chaotic storm of emotions violently flickered across her perfectly powdered face. Pure alarm, cold calculation, and then rapid, sociopathic recovery. Her features instantly smoothed out into a flawless, terrifyingly pleasant smile. It was as smooth and deadly as a silk ribbon wrapping around a throat. Beatrice, darling, I will absolutely have to call you back later, Victoria cooed, smoothly tucking her expensive cell phone away into her pocket. Sabrina, I honestly did not even hear you lurking out there in the dark hallway. I was just having a very intense discussion regarding a complex staffing issue at the corporate office. That sounded incredibly serious. I managed to stammer out, my voice shaking visibly. Oh, it is absolutely nothing your pretty little head needs to worry about. Her artificial smile sharpened into something resembling a blade. Please, just run along back to your little apartment now. I am absolutely certain you have hundreds of childish finger paintings to grade, or whatever trivial things it is you do with your time. She confidently brushed right past me in the narrow hallway, leaving behind a suffocating, lingering trail of expensive designer perfume and something infinitely more dark and poisonous. I stood entirely alone in that dark corridor. For a very long time, Victoria's vicious words aggressively echoing inside my skull like a repetitive nightmare. They weren't just casually dismissing my existence anymore. They were actively, meticulously plotting my permanent public removal from the bloodline. The long drive up into the mountains to visit Beatrice usually took 4 hours. But that night, it felt like an endless, agonizing eternity. Victoria's venomous voice kept relentlessly replaying on a loop inside my mind. Once she publicly embarrasses herself badly enough, she will leave on her own. Was that exactly what 32 agonizing years of survival had been building toward? A meticulously orchestrated, highly public humiliation explicitly designed to force me to permanently erase myself from their world? By the time my rattling car finally pulled into Beatrice's long, winding gravel driveway, the sun was rapidly setting behind the jagged, purple mountain peaks. Her small, rustic cottage glowed incredibly warm and golden in the twilight, thick with smoke lazily curling from the stone chimney. She was already patiently waiting for me on the wooden porch, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. You look exactly like a woman who has been physically carrying a crushing, suffocating weight for 1,000 miles, she observed astutely, immediately, folding my trembling body into a fierce, warm hug. Aunt Beatrice, you have absolutely no idea, I whispered into her shoulder, finally letting a single tear fall. We sat together in front of the crackling stone fireplace that entire evening, completely surrounded by towering walls of ancient books and the deeply comforting scent of burning cedar wood. Beatrice sat in absolute silence and listened intently as I tearfully recounted absolutely everything. I told her about the agonizing Friday night dinners, Victoria's sinister, plotted phone call in the hallway, and the crushing, relentless, exhausting reality of feeling like a hostile, unwanted alien inside my own biological family. When I finally finished speaking, the room fell into a very long, very heavy silence. Only the sound of the popping fire broke the quiet. "Sabrina," she finally said, her voice incredibly thick with emotion and resolve, "there is something I desperately need to show you right now." She slowly rose from her worn armchair and walked purposefully over to a massive, ancient cedar chest, resting in the dark corner of the room. It was a beautiful, carved box I had seen sitting there 100 times before during my visits, but had never once thought to ask about its contents. She slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid and carefully extracted a smaller, beautifully polished wooden lockbox. It was heavily weathered with significant age and intricately hand-carved with delicate, blooming jasmine flowers. "This specific box belonged entirely to your mother," Beatrice stated, walking back and sitting down heavily. My breath instantly caught sharply in my throat. "Margaret secretly gave this to me just a few weeks before she tragically died," Beatrice continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She made me swear an absolute, unbreakable blood oath to keep it completely safe from him. And she made me promise to only give it to you when you were finally, truly ready." "Ready? For what exactly?" I whispered, staring at the carved wood. Beatrice firmly pressed the heavy box directly into my shaking hands. "For the absolute, unvarnished truth." I slowly unlatched the brass clasp and opened the lid. Inside the box, I found dozens of faded, beautiful Polaroid photographs of my mother as a vibrant young woman. She looked absolutely radiant, head thrown back in genuine, uninhibited laughter. It was a version of her full of wild, untamed life that I had never, ever witnessed in my own memories of her. Resting carefully beneath the stack of photographs lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages heavily yellowed and incredibly fragile to the touch. And resting at the very bottom of the box, hiding beneath everything else, was a single, thick, sealed white envelope. It was addressed in my mother's unmistakable, elegant handwriting. The text simply read, "For Sabrina, when she is finally strong enough to survive it." I honestly have absolutely no idea what is written inside that envelope, Beatrice said incredibly softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Margaret never, ever told me the contents, but she was incredibly, fiercely insistent about its importance. She swore to me one day Sabrina is going to desperately need the ammunition inside this letter to survive him. I sat by the fire, holding the sealed envelope in my violently trembling hands, physically feeling its immense weight like a solid block of lead. 27 long, agonizing years of dark family secrets, completely sealed away in fragile paper and deafening silence. I honestly wasn't entirely sure if my heart was strong enough to handle it, but I was rapidly beginning to realize that the universe was no longer giving me a choice in the matter. I absolutely could not bring myself to tear open the envelope that night by the fire. I simply couldn't do it. Instead, I carefully tucked it safely back into the carved wooden box, and early the next morning, I drove the long, miserable highway back down to the city, with the box sitting securely on my passenger seat exactly like a live, ticking time bomb. At every single red traffic light, during every single agonizing delay in traffic, I would nervously glance over at it, my mind racing, obsessively wondering what horrifying truth my mother had been so desperately terrified to tell me while she was breathing. But mundane life, as it always cruelly does, violently intervened and demanded my attention. Before I could open it, Exactly 1 week prior to the massive Founders Day event, Victoria aggressively scheduled a mandatory, full-family video conference call. The stated purpose was to coordinate the complex logistics for the upcoming celebration. But what that actually realistically meant was Victoria aggressively ensuring that every single prop in the play looked absolutely flawless for the hovering media cameras. Arthur's stern, imposing face filled my laptop screen, looking exactly like a ruthless tribunal judge preparing to pass a death sentence. Victoria hovered closely behind his shoulder, ensuring she was in frame. Vanessa enthusiastically waved from her brightly lit corner of the screen, and Julian offered his signature, arrogant smirk from what appeared to be the interior of his massive, glass corner office. The premier photographer from the financial magazine will be arriving at exactly 6 o'clock sharp, Arthur announced, his voice a booming command. Every single member of this family must be fully dressed and present in the main hall by 5:30 p.m. This is a strictly enforced, formal black tie event. I fully expect every single one of you to represent the Sterling Empire appropriately. His cold, dead eyes slowly shifted on the screen until they locked directly onto my video feed. Sabrina, that specific order applies to you most especially. Absolutely none of your cheap, pathetic, discount teacher clothing will be tolerated. I know exactly how to dress myself for a formal event, Father, I replied, my jaw tightly clenched. Do you really? Julian instantly chimed in, laughing obnoxiously. I can easily have my assistant order you something presentable from a high-end boutique. My personal treat. Just consider it a charitable donation to the needy. Julian laughed uproariously at his own incredibly cruel joke. Absolutely no one else on the call even cracked a smile. That will be absolutely unnecessary, Julian, I stated, my voice freezing cold. Arthur, Victoria interjected quickly, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness. Perhaps you could just generously provide Sabrina with a small, one-time clothing allowance. Just for this one specific evening. We certainly wouldn't want any unfortunate, embarrassing photographs of our family circulating in the high society press. No, I violently cut her off before Arthur could even formulate a response. I will absolutely handle my own wardrobe for the evening. Thank you very much for your deep concern. Arthur let out a massive, highly theatrical, incredibly heavy sigh. It was a specific sound of profound disappointment he had meticulously perfected over 3 decades of raising me. You have always been so incredibly, infuriatingly stubborn, Sabrina. Exactly, completely just like your mother. The heavy words hit me entirely differently this time. Just like your mother. He had thrown that exact phrase in my face 1,000 times before during arguments. I had always automatically assumed it was a vicious insult. Arthur's twisted way of telling me that I was inherently difficult, overly emotional, and completely impractical. But sitting there staring at the screen with my mother's unopened, secret envelope waiting for me on the kitchen counter, I suddenly heard something entirely different hiding underneath his anger. Something that sounded remarkably, terrifyingly like genuine fear. That exact night, I fell into a deep sleep and had an incredibly vivid dream about my mother. It was not the usual, vague, blurry impressions I typically carried in my mind, the faint smell of jasmine or the soft, soothing sound of her voice reading bedtime stories. This was a razor-sharp, crystal-clear, hyper-realistic memory violently surfacing after decades of being buried deep in my subconscious. I was exactly 4 years old in the memory. My mother and I were sitting together in my childhood bedroom, the specific room with the bright yellow curtains she had meticulously sewn by hand. She was gently, rhythmically brushing my hair, softly counting every single stroke out loud exactly like she always did to calm me down. 98, 99, 100. There we go. My beautiful, perfect girl. She gently wrapped her arms securely around my small shoulders from behind, and we quietly looked at our shared reflection in the large vanity mirror together. Her thick, dark raven hair contrasting sharply with my light, sandy brown hair. Her warm, deep brown eyes contrasting against my piercing, bright blue ones. "Mama," I had asked in my tiny, innocent voice, "why do I look so incredibly different from Daddy?" My mother's body went completely, terrifyingly still. Behind me, just for a fraction of a second. "Because you look exactly like me, my sweet girl," she had answered smoothly. "And that is an incredibly beautiful, wonderful thing to be. But does Daddy actually think it is a good thing?" I had pressed, sensing the tension. She didn't answer me right away. When she finally spoke again, her voice was completely devoid of its usual softness. It was fierce, unyielding, and terrifyingly strong. "Listen to me very, very closely, Sabrina. You are the absolute greatest gift the universe has ever given me. No matter what anyone in this house ever says to you, no matter what cruel things anyone ever does to you, you are profoundly loved. You are deeply wanted. You are more than enough. But Daddy, your Daddy, is going to have to learn that truth the hard way." She pulled me against her chest and held me incredibly tight. "I will personally make absolutely sure of it." Heavy, aggressive footsteps suddenly echoed in the hallway outside the bedroom. We both violently looked up. Arthur was standing silently in the doorway, watching the two of us with an expression that was far too complex and dark for my 4-year-old brain to comprehend. My mother bravely met his freezing gaze in the mirror, and she absolutely did not flinch. "She is our beautiful daughter, Arthur," she stated, her voice like steel. "Ours." Arthur did not say a single word. In response, he simply turned on his heel and walked away into the shadows of the house. Exactly 1 year later, my mother was dead. A tragic solo car accident on a notoriously treacherous, rain-slicked mountain curve. The local police officially ruled that she had simply lost control of the vehicle due to the severe weather conditions. I was only 5 years old when they lowered her casket into the freezing ground. 27 years later, I jolted awake in my dark city apartment, my face completely soaked with hot tears, a terrifying, massive realization firmly settling deep into the marrow of my bones. My mother had been fiercely, desperately trying to protect me from something monstrous. And whatever dark, horrifying truth it was, she had violently taken it with her to the grave. Until right now, the highly anticipated day of the massive Founders' Day celebration finally arrived, bringing with it the exact kind of flawless, beautiful weather that felt like a sick, cruel cosmic joke. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, the temperature a perfect 72 degrees, without a single cloud visible on the horizon. The sprawling Sterling estate had been completely transformed by an army of event planners into something resembling a royal coronation. Massive, pristine white event tents dotted the expansive back lawn. A professional jazz quartet played softly beneath the blooming pergola. Dozens of hired waitstaff in crisp, identical uniforms circulated flawlessly with heavy silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive caviar. And there were flowers. Flowers. Absolutely everywhere. Thousands of imported white roses, peonies, and rare orchids. It was Victoria's signature, oppressive touch, specifically designed to loudly remind every single guest that absolute elegance could easily be purchased if you simply ordered enough delivery trucks. I arrived at the front gates at exactly 5:30 p.m., precisely as I had been aggressively instructed. I was wearing a simple, elegant, classic black dress that I had happily found on a clearance rack for 60% off. It was not a famous designer label. It was not incredibly remarkable or flashy, but it fit my body perfectly. And infinitely more importantly, it was entirely mine, purchased with my own hard-earned money. Victoria immediately intercepted me the very second I stepped through the grand double doors. "Oh, Sabrina." Her sharp, predatory eyes aggressively swept over my entire body with surgical precision, searching for any flaw to attack. "You actually managed to show up. Was there ever any genuine doubt?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. One truly never knows what to expect with your erratic behavior, she sneered. She aggressively reached out and forcefully adjusted my collar as if I were a disobedient toddler. Well, at least you made a marginal effort tonight. Please try your absolute hardest to remain completely invisible in the background during the professional photographs, won't you? The harsh lighting is incredibly unforgiving for certain complexions. I violently bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from screaming a response, and silently stepped past her into the foyer. The grand, cavernous dining room had been meticulously set to accommodate exactly 50 elite guests. The massive mahogany table, which normally felt incredibly oppressive, now stretched the entire length of the ballroom, draped in pristine, imported white linen and anchored by towering, obnoxious floral centerpieces. There were hand-lettered calligraphy place cards at every seat, heavy lead crystal glasses at every setting, and a beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner, patiently waiting for the hired musician to arrive. And sitting proudly at the absolute head of the table was a massive, ornate, throne-like chair specifically reserved for the guest of honor, Arthur Sterling, Visionary Builder of the Year. I quickly found my assigned place card near the absolute far end of the long table, strategically wedged between a distant, boring cousin I barely remembered, and a completely empty chair reserved for late arrivals. I was seated as physically far away from Arthur as logistically possible within the confines of the room. Some toxic things, it appeared, never truly changed. By exactly 7 o'clock, all 50 heavy wooden seats were filled. I recognized the vast majority of the faces in the room. Aunts, uncles, second cousins twice removed. The Sterling family tree was incredibly vast and deeply complicated, held together not by any genuine affection or loyalty, but almost entirely by a shared, parasitic interest in Arthur's massive wealth. They all eagerly showed up for the free vintage champagne and the lucrative corporate networking opportunities. Actual familial love was entirely optional, mixed seamlessly. Among the blood relatives were Arthur's elite business associates, powerful men, wearing bespoke, custom suits, and their wives wearing extravagant designer gowns, all laughing a little too loudly and a little too eagerly at Arthur's terrible jokes. And hovering in the corner of the room was the professional photographer, meticulously documenting every single fake smile for the massive puff piece that would undoubtedly crown Arthur a visionary genius. The extravagant evening progressed exactly like a carefully, obsessively orchestrated theatrical performance. Endless rounds of expensive appetizers, hollow, self-congratulatory toasts, and highly sanitized anecdotes about Arthur's early struggles that conveniently, completely omitted any mention of my mother's family money funding his initial empire. Victoria flawlessly played the role of the gracious, benevolent hostess, smoothly gliding between the tables with heavily practiced, terrifying ease. Julian arrogantly held court near the open bar, loudly boasting about his latest conquests. Vanessa aggressively posed for the roaming photographer as if she were desperately auditioning for a high-fashion magazine cover. And I sat completely alone in my dark corner, strictly speaking only when someone directly addressed me. Then came the main event. Arthur slowly, dramatically rose from his throne chair, his crystal glass held high in his hand, and the entire massive room instantly fell completely silent. He was wearing a flawless charcoal gray custom suit, a disgustingly expensive, limited edition watch gleaming brightly on his wrist. His silver hair was combed perfectly into place. His arrogant smile was entirely camera-ready. I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for being here tonight, he began, his booming voice carrying the undeniable supreme confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told the word no. This prestigious award means a truly great deal to me, not merely because of the massive professional success it represents, but entirely because of the incredible people sitting in this room who made the journey possible. He proudly gestured toward Victoria, my beautiful, dedicated wife, who fiercely stands by my side through every single storm. The room erupted into loud, polite applause. My brilliant son, Julian, who will undoubtedly carry the massive, sterling corporate legacy long into the future. Even louder applause. Julian smugly raised his glass in acknowledgement. My beautiful daughter, Vanessa, who effortlessly brings elegance, grace, and fierce ambition to absolutely everything she touches. Vanessa beamed a brilliant, camera-ready smile. Victoria delicately dabbed at completely fake, non-existent tears with her napkin. And, of course, Arthur paused dramatically, his cold gaze slowly, deliberately, sweeping down the entire length of the long table until it finally locked directly onto me. I am incredibly, profoundly proud of all my successful children. He paused again, significantly longer this time, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. With the glaring exception of the absolute failure currently sitting at the far end of this table. The brutal words dropped into the center of the room exactly like a live bomb. For one agonizing, suspended heartbeat, the entire dining room was completely frozen in shock. Then a business associate nervously laughed. Then another relative joined in. Then, incredibly, Julian was loudly, slowly applauding, a cruel, mocking smirk plastered across his face. "It is about damn time you finally said the truth out loud, Dad," Julian called out. Victoria firmly pressed her lips together, violently suppressing a victorious, wicked smile. 50 pairs of eyes simultaneously turned to stare at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. I felt something deep, ancient, and heavy inside my soul go very, very quiet. I did not start crying. I know with absolute certainty that is exactly what they all expected me to do. That is exactly what they desperately wanted. Sabrina, the pathetic, overly sensitive one. Sabrina, the emotional, weak link. Sabrina, who would inevitably flee the room in hysterical tears and definitively prove to the entire world, once and for all, that she absolutely did not belong in their elite presence. But something fundamental, something tectonic had violently shifted inside me. Perhaps it was the crushing weight of my mother's unopened letter still resting inside my purse. Perhaps it was the horrific memory of Victoria's secret phone call echoing in my skull. She will leave entirely on her own. Or perhaps it was simply the reality of 32 long, agonizing years of violently swallowing their insults finally reaching critical mass. Whatever the catalyst was, my tear ducts remained completely dry. Instead of crying, I slowly, deliberately stood up from my chair. The cruel laughter instantly died in their throats. The massive room went completely silent again, but this time, the silence was heavy with profound confusion. I was absolutely not following their meticulously written script. Slowly, with measured, echoing footsteps, I began walking the entire length of the room, toward the head of the table. My cheap heels clicked loudly and rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The photographer rapidly raised his camera to his face, instantly sensing that something highly newsworthy and dramatic was about to occur. Arthur watched me approach him, his arrogant smirk faltering very slightly. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" he demanded quietly. I did not offer him an answer. I slowly reached into my small black purse and withdrew a crisp, plain white envelope. It was entirely unremarkable on the outside, but it was incredibly heavy with the devastating truth I had uncovered over the past 2 months. I gently, carefully placed the envelope directly onto his pristine porcelain plate, right next to his completely untouched, expensive dessert. "A special gift just for you, Dad," I said, my voice incredibly steady, clear and loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Happy Founder's Day to you." Arthur stared down at the plain envelope as if it were a highly venomous snake, preparing to strike him. "What in the hell is this garbage? Is this just another one of your pathetic, overly sentimental, handmade cards? Why don't you simply open it and find out for yourself?" I challenged him. Victoria leaned aggressively forward over the table. "Arthur, please," Do not engage with her. Pathetic, childish theatrics right now. Open the damn envelope, Arthur, I commanded. Our eyes violently locked. For the very first time in my entire 32 years of existence, I absolutely did not look away first. I held his gaze until something dark and terrified flickered across his face. Deep uncertainty, perhaps even genuine fear. But I absolutely did not stick around to watch the explosion. I simply turned around and began walking toward the grand exit doors. 50 stunned, silent guests physically parted like the Red Sea to allow me to pass, entirely too shocked to speak a single word. Sabrina. Arthur's voice violently cracked, shattering the silence. Get back here. Right this second. You absolutely do not ever turn your back and walk away from me. I paused briefly at the heavy threshold, but I absolutely did not turn around to look at him. I just did, I said calmly to the empty air. And then I walked out the door and I was completely gone. Now, let me aggressively drag you right back 3 weeks in time. Right after that horrific, degrading video call where Arthur explicitly commanded me not to dress like a pathetic teacher, I finally managed to scrape together the courage to open my dead mother's sealed envelope. I sat alone on my apartment floor in the dark with the carved wooden box resting beside me, Aunt Beatrice's heavy words echoing endlessly in my mind for the absolute truth. My hands violently shook as I physically broke the old wax seal. Inside the envelope, I found 2 heavy legal documents and a multi-page letter entirely written in my mother's beautiful, looping handwriting. I read the personal letter first. My dearest, sweet Sabrina, if you are finally reading these words, it means that I am no longer on this earth to protect you from the monsters. And for that, I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry. There is a massive, crushing secret I absolutely should have told you while I was still breathing. But I was entirely too terrified. I was absolutely terrified of permanently losing you. I was terrified of exactly what Arthur was capable of doing to us. The absolute truth is, Sabrina, Arthur Sterling is absolutely not your biological father. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. Before I ever met Arthur, I was deeply, profoundly in love with someone else. A wonderful man named David Whitfield. He was incredibly kind, unimaginably gentle, and he loved me completely, without any conditions. We were planning to be married in the spring, but David tragically died in a horrific workplace accident exactly 2 months before our wedding date, and I discovered that I was pregnant with you shortly after his funeral. My elite, image-obsessed family was utterly devastated by the scandal. A child born entirely out of wedlock would have permanently, publicly ruined our pristine social reputation in those days. So, when Arthur Sterling suddenly proposed to me, it was not out of love. He desperately needed my family's massive, highly valuable ancestral land rights for his new commercial developments. My parents saw an easy, clean solution to their scandal. Arthur explicitly agreed to marry me, and he agreed to legally adopt you as his own, entirely in exchange for the permanent property rights to the land. It was absolutely nothing more than a cold, calculated business transaction. He swore a sacred oath that he would treat you exactly as his own, flesh and blood. He violently, maliciously lied. Tears were rapidly blurring my vision, staining the old paper. I spent every single day of our miserable marriage helplessly watching him deeply resent you simply for existing. And I was completely, utterly powerless to stop the abuse. I tried, Sabrina. God knows I tried to fight him, but he was far too powerful, far too wealthy, and I was far too broken and weak. I am securely enclosing your original, sealed legal adoption certificate inside this envelope. It is the undeniable legal proof that you are absolutely not Arthur's biological daughter. Keep this document incredibly safe. One day you may desperately need it to survive him. Please, you must always know this one absolute truth. You were created entirely from pure, genuine love. Real love. David would have absolutely adored every single thing about you. And I love you, infinitely more than my own miserable life. You are absolutely not a mistake. You are my greatest miracle. Forever yours, Mama. I sat completely paralyzed on my apartment floor for over an hour, clutching the fragile letter tightly to my chest, hot tears streaming relentlessly down my face. But they were absolutely not tears of sadness. They were tears of profound, overwhelming, earth-shattering release. For 32 agonizing years, I had desperately, exhaustingly tried to earn the basic love and approval of a man who had never, ever possessed the slightest intention of giving it to me. And now I finally, completely understood exactly why. The emotional letter was one thing. Incontrovertible legal proof was entirely another. Early the very next morning, I called Marcus Thorne, my absolute closest colleague and friend at the school. We had been deeply trusted friends for over 3 years. He was the exact kind of rare, reliable friend who magically shows up with hot coffee when you are exhausted, grading papers at midnight. The kind who actively listens to your problems without an ounce of judgment. The kind who never, not once, made me feel like I was a failure in life. I desperately need your help right now, Marcus, I told him over the phone. And I need you to swear absolute, total confidentiality. I will do absolutely anything you need, he replied instantly, without hesitation. I sat down with him and explicitly explained the entire nightmare. My mother's secret letter, the hidden adoption certificate, 27 agonizing years of unexplained, freezing coldness from a man I had spent my entire existence desperately trying to impress. Marcus did not hesitate for a single second. What exactly do you need me to do? I need to secure a certified DNA test to definitively confirm the truth. Getting a physical sample of Arthur's DNA was significantly easier than I had initially anticipated. During one of the excruciating Friday night dinners, he had arrogantly left his expensive suit jacket draped carelessly over the back of a dining chair while he stepped into his office. Right before I slipped out the front door, I quickly pulled several loose hairs directly from the collar of his jacket, making absolute certain the follicles were still physically attached to the strands. Legally, the action resided in a very murky, dark gray area. Ethically, I was completely, utterly past caring about the rules. I mailed the samples to a highly secure, ABB-accredited genetics testing facility, the absolute gold standard required for legal paternity testing. They promised certified results within 2 weeks. Those 14 days felt exactly like 14 agonizing years in purgatory. When the notification email finally arrived in my inbox, I was sitting entirely alone in my quiet classroom long after the school had emptied out, completely surrounded by towering stacks of ungraded student essays. My hands violently shook as I slowly clicked open the encrypted PDF document. Probability of paternity, 0%. Conclusion: the alleged father is entirely excluded as the biological parent of the subject, 0%. Not a single microscopic shadow of a doubt. Not a fractional possibility. Absolute 0. I sat perfectly still in that completely empty classroom, the harsh fluorescent lights loudly buzzing overhead, and I slowly started to laugh. I laughed until tears streamed down my face. All those agonizing years of my life. All that desperate, pathetic striving. All those excruciating moments where I thought to myself, if I just try a little bit harder, if I am just a little bit more successful, maybe he will finally love me. He was absolutely never, ever going to love me. Not because I wasn't smart enough or good enough, but simply because I was never his biological child to love in the first place. Marcus found me still sitting frozen at my desk nearly an hour later, the printed test results clutched tightly in my shaking hands. "Are you okay?" he asked incredibly quietly, stepping into the room. I slowly looked up at him with wet, bloodshot eyes and offered the very first genuine, true smile I had felt in months. I am significantly better right now than I have been in 32 years. That night, completely alone in the safety of my apartment, I finally allowed myself to completely fall apart. I sat heavily on my bedroom floor, holding my mother's old photograph tightly in my hands, the specific picture I had found inside Aunt Beatrice's cedar box. The photo where Margaret was laughing, radiantly in a bright summer dress, her entire beautiful life stretching out ahead of her. She couldn't have been more than 23 years old in the picture. "You knew," I whispered fiercely to her smiling image. "You always knew he would never, ever accept me, and you desperately tried to protect me anyway." For the very first time in my life, I truly, deeply understood the profound, haunting sadness I had always instinctively sensed hiding just beneath her smiles. The desperate way she used to hold me just a little too tightly. The fierce, almost terrified way she used to constantly tell me I was unconditionally loved. She intimately knew that her time on this earth was rapidly running out, and she was desperately trying to inject me with enough maternal love to last me for an entire lifetime. I wept violently for her that night. I cried for the beautiful, happy life she absolutely should have experienced with David Whitfield. I cried for the miserable, cold marriage she had been violently trapped in with a monster who deeply resented her only child. I cried for the tragic car accident that violently took her away far too soon, leaving me completely defenseless against the wolves. But somewhere deep within that overwhelming hurricane of grief, something entirely new and powerful began to emerge. Absolute freedom. For 32 agonizing years, I had physically carried Arthur's relentless rejection like a heavy iron millstone chained around my neck. I had fundamentally believed that his freezing coldness was entirely my own fault. I believed that if I had just been slightly smarter, significantly more successful, or acted more like the golden child, Julian, maybe he would have finally deemed me worthy of love. But the absolute truth was infinitely simpler and significantly more brutal. I was absolutely never going to win a game when I didn't even know I was actively playing on the board. I slowly looked down at the pile of evidence resting on my floor. The official adoption papers, the certified DNA results, my mother's heartbreaking letter. This was absolutely not about petty revenge. I did not want a single cent of Arthur's massive fortune. I did not want his fake, conditional approval anymore. I simply wanted to permanently stop pretending. I desperately wanted the absolute, undeniable truth to be spoken out loud in the exact same room where I had been systematically humiliated and degraded for decades. And I desperately wanted to turn my back and walk away, not as a pathetic failure fleeing the room in shame, but as a powerful woman who finally, truly comprehended her own inherent worth. "I absolutely do not owe those monsters a single thing," I whispered to the empty room. And for the very first time in my life, I actually believed my own words. If you are still listening to this story, perhaps you intimately know exactly what this specific agony feels like. That devastating, earth-shattering moment when you finally realize you have spent your entire life desperately chasing someone's approval, and they were absolutely never, ever going to grant it to you. Not because you weren't brilliant or good enough, but because they had already maliciously decided you were completely unworthy before you ever even had a fighting chance to prove yourself. Have you ever been forced to construct massive, ironclad boundaries to protect yourself from toxic family members? Someone who constantly, intentionally made you feel like you would never measure up to their impossible standards? Please drop a comment below and share your story with us. And if you desperately want to know exactly what catastrophic explosion occurred when my father finally ripped open that white envelope, keep watching, because his scream of agony could be heard through the walls of the entire estate. Before I could execute my confrontation with Arthur, I desperately needed one final, undeniable piece of legal confirmation. Aunt Beatrice had provided me with a specific name: Walter Evans. He was the highly respected senior lawyer who meticulously handled all of your mother's private affairs, she had explained. to me over the phone, and he specifically handled the highly confidential adoption paperwork. If there is a single living soul who can legally verify exactly what these ancient documents mean, it is absolutely him. Walter Evans was 72 years old, happily retired for over 5 years, currently living in a very modest, quiet colonial home in the suburbs. When I called his private number and explained exactly who I was, the line went completely, suffocatingly dead for a very long moment. "Margaret's daughter," he finally whispered, his gravelly voice heavy with an emotion that sounded remarkably like deep, ancient regret. I have honestly been sitting here waiting for this specific phone call for a very, very long time. We met in person the next day in his dark, wood-paneled home office entirely, surrounded by towering shelves of heavy, leather-bound legal volumes and framed silver photographs of his grandchildren. He moved incredibly slowly, his body frail with age, but his mind remained as razor-sharp as surgical steel. I carefully laid out the evidence on his desk. The sealed adoption certificate, the certified Genesis DNA results, my mother's handwritten letter. He meticulously read every single document in absolute silence, adjusting his reading glasses. Then he slowly removed his glasses and aggressively rubbed his tired eyes. "It is all entirely, legally legitimate," he stated with a heavy sigh. "I personally drafted that specific adoption agreement with my own 2 hands. Exactly 32 years ago. Arthur physically signed the documents sitting right here in my office." So, he knew the absolute truth from the very beginning, I whispered, the reality finally sinking in. He knew I wasn't his before the wedding even took place. Walter's voice turned incredibly bitter. "Your mother was completely, entirely upfront with him about her unexpected pregnancy. She honorably offered to immediately release him from the engagement contract to avoid a scandal. But Arthur immediately saw a massive, highly lucrative opportunity. Her family's ancestral land holdings were worth millions of dollars in development rights. He eagerly agreed to marry her, and he explicitly agreed to legally adopt you, entirely in exchange for the permanent property rights to her land. The entire marriage was nothing more than a cold, calculated corporate business transaction. He swore a legally binding oath that he would raise you and treat you exactly as his own flesh and blood." Walter slowly shook his head in disgust. "But I quietly watched him over the decades. I saw exactly how he maliciously treated you at the few family events I attended. I remember how your desperate mother would call my office crying, hysterically, begging to know if there was absolutely any legal recourse to force him to be kind. But she was entirely trapped by the financial contracts. We both were." I sat there in silence, letting the horrifying magnitude of the betrayal fully sink into my bones. "Would you possibly be willing to legally confirm all of this on the record, if it ever came to a court battle?" I asked him. Walter slowly met my gaze, his eyes fierce. "I am 72 years old, Miss Sterling. I am absolutely no longer terrified of Arthur's power or his money. I absolutely should have spoken up and exposed him decades ago." He reached across the heavy desk and gently squeezed my trembling hand. "Your mother would be so incredibly, fiercely proud of the woman you are today." The frantic week before the Founders' Day Gala, Marcus came over to my apartment to help me meticulously prepare. I desperately need to be perfectly clear about my intentions. I was absolutely not meticulously planning some elaborate, Hollywood-style, malicious revenge scheme. I was absolutely not attempting to aggressively destroy Arthur's corporate business or maliciously steal his massive fortune or vindicatively ruin his new family. I simply, desperately, wanted to stop living a lie. "So, what exactly is the grand master plan?" Marcus asked, carefully spreading the explosive documents across my small kitchen table. I looked down at the mountain of undeniable evidence. The certified DNA results, a legally authenticated copy of the original adoption certificate, and a personal, handwritten letter I had painstakingly drafted myself. It was incredibly short, brutally direct, containing zero emotional accusations. Just the cold, hard, indisputable facts. Dad, I wrote, I am absolutely not your biological daughter. You have known this. Undeniable fact since long before I was even born. Mom's hidden letter explicitly explains everything, and the certified DNA test conclusively confirms it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Thank you for legally providing a physical roof over my head for 18 years. But I absolutely do not owe you a lifetime of groveling gratitude for aggressively treating me like a parasitic burden I never ever asked to be. I am absolutely not looking for a single cent of your money or your inheritance. I formally and completely release any and all legal claim to the Sterling estate. I simply wanted you to finally know that I know the truth, and that I am entirely done pretending for your ego. Sabrina. Marcus read the short letter twice in complete silence. That is it? He asked, looking up at me in disbelief. No dramatic, you are a sociopathic monster? No. Rot in hell for eternity? That is absolutely not the kind of human being I want to be, I replied softly. But after absolutely everything horrific thing he has intentionally done to you. Exactly, I interrupted him, carefully folding the letter. He has spent 32 agonizing years actively trying to make me feel small, pathetic, and worthless. If I violently stoop to his level and scream, he ultimately wins the game. But if I calmly walk away with my head held high, with my dignity completely intact, armed with the absolute truth, that is an ultimate victory he can never, ever steal from me. Marcus remained completely quiet for a long, contemplative moment. Then he offered a very soft, incredibly sad smile. You know with absolute certainty that they will never, ever forgive you for doing this, right? They never, ever forgave me simply for being born, I replied, sliding the heavy stack of documents into the crisp white envelope. At least now, they will finally have an actual, legitimate reason to hate me. I aggressively sealed the envelope and grabbed a Sharpie. I wrote on the front in bold black letters, for Arthur. I did not include a return address. I left absolutely no room for a fake reconciliation. Just the unvarnished truth, finally spoken into the light. The agonizing night before the gala, sleep completely evaded me. I lay flat on my back in bed, staring blankly at the dark ceiling, frantically running through every single possible, disastrous scenario in my head. Arthur opening the explosive envelope in total privacy. Arthur opening it publicly and exploding. Arthur arrogantly throwing it directly into the fireplace completely unread. But my racing mind kept continuously arriving back at the exact same peaceful conclusion. It absolutely did not matter what his reaction was. My internal peace was absolutely no longer dependent on his validation or his rage. I slowly got out of bed and walked over to my wooden dresser, where my mother's beautiful photograph sat right beside a small, crystal vase of fresh jasmine, her absolute favorite flower. I had recently started buying the flowers weekly. It was a small, comforting ritual that somehow made me feel incredibly close to her spirit. Hey, Mama, I whispered into the quiet room, looking at her smiling face. Tomorrow is finally the day. The room remained completely silent, obviously, but I could almost perfectly hear her warm, comforting voice echoing in the back of my mind, exactly the way she used to speak to me right before I fell asleep. You are absolutely enough, my sweet girl. Exactly as you are. I thought deeply about the immense magnitude of what she had sacrificed for me, willingly marrying a cold, ruthless monster she absolutely did not love, entirely to protect her unborn child from ruin. Spending agonizing years trapped inside a freezing, loveless marriage, forced to watch helplessly as Arthur relentlessly directed all of his venomous resentment at an innocent little girl, tragically dying before she ever had the chance to see her daughter grow up and thrive. She fundamentally deserved infinitely better than Arthur Sterling. And so did I. I slowly picked up the sealed white envelope from my nightstand, physically feeling its immense weight in my trembling hands. If he is incredibly cruel to me tomorrow, and I know he almost certainly will be, it absolutely won't shatter my soul anymore, I said out loud to the empty apartment. Because I finally possess the absolute truth now. I finally know exactly who I am, and my inherent worth has absolutely nothing to do with his validation. The sweet scent of jasmine gently swayed in the cool breeze drifting through my open bedroom window. I carefully tucked the explosive envelope safely into my small black purse, climbed back into my bed, and for the very first time in weeks, I slept incredibly deeply and entirely dreamlessly. When I finally woke up the next morning, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced in years. I felt completely, utterly ready. Not ready for a violent, screaming battle. Not ready for petty revenge. Just absolutely, finally ready to be free. Now, let me aggressively drag you right back to that massive dining room, to the exact, explosive moment immediately after I walked out the heavy oak doors. Arthur sat completely frozen at the absolute head of the table, the plain white envelope resting innocently on his plate like a ticking bomb waiting to detonate. What in the absolute hell was that pathetic little display about? Julian laughed nervously, desperately attempting to break the suffocating, heavy tension in the room. Classic, hysterical Sabrina. Always so incredibly dramatic. For attention. But Arthur was absolutely not laughing. His hand moved toward the envelope. Incredibly slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he knew the paper was radioactive. Victoria leaned aggressively over his shoulder, her intense, paranoid curiosity temporarily overriding her usual, flawless aristocratic composure. "It is probably absolutely nothing, Arthur," she whispered soothingly. "Just some passive, aggressive, pathetic little thank you note for allowing her to attend. Just ignore it." Arthur violently tore the paper envelope open. The very first page slowly slid out. The certified Genesis DNA test results. His eyes rapidly scanned the bold black text on the document, and I am reliably told by a younger cousin who was sitting entirely too close to him that absolutely all the blood violently drained from his face in approximately 3 seconds. "Arthur." Victoria's voice instantly sharpened into a blade. "What exactly is it? What does it say?" He did not utter a single syllable in response. His large hands were visibly, violently shaking as he frantically pulled out the second, heavy document. The official, notarized adoption certificate. His own unmistakable signature. Permanently inked and dated exactly 32 years ago. "Arthur." Victoria demanded louder this time. The third document he pulled out was my personal, handwritten letter. He read my short message in complete, absolute silence. His heavy jaw clenching tighter and tighter with every single line he absorbed. And then, according to my terrified cousin, Arthur Sterling, the supposedly unshakable, flawless patriarch, the ruthless, self-made billionaire who had never, ever shown a single microscopic ounce of vulnerability in his entire professional life. He opened his mouth and he screamed, "No, no, no, no." The massive, expensive crystal glass of vintage Chateau Margaux was violently swept off the table, shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. Against the floor, dark red wine aggressively spread across the pristine white linen tablecloth exactly like pooling blood. "Arthur, what the hell is happening right now?" Victoria aggressively snatched the papers directly out of his trembling hands, her eyes frantically darting across the heavy, bold text. "Certified DNA results? Probability of paternity 0%. What is this? Absolute insanity." Her voice was so incredibly loud and shrill that the guests sitting closest to them clearly heard every single word she shrieked. And in a massive, echoing room completely full of wealthy, elite gossips, that was absolutely all it took. The vicious whispers erupted instantaneously, spreading like a wildfire. "DNA test? 0% match? Sabrina isn't actually his biological daughter." Arthur was physically clutching the sharp edge of the mahogany table exactly like a drowning man clinging to a raft, endlessly, frantically mumbling under his breath, "This absolutely cannot be right. This is a lie. This cannot be right." The professional photographer from the financial magazine was rapidly snapping photographs, aggressively capturing every single second of the absolute meltdown. And somewhere far out in the dark parking lot, I was calmly climbing into my beat-up Honda Civic, my hands perfectly steady on the steering wheel, my heart violently pounding with an emotion that wasn't quite triumphant joy. It was profound, absolute relief. Victoria, for all her terrifying, calculating cunning, made a massive, fatal, catastrophic mistake in that exact moment. She completely panicked out loud in front of an audience. An official adoption certificate. She was still staring blankly at the legal papers in her hands, her shrill voice effortlessly carrying across the suddenly dead silent, massive room. "Arthur, you actually legally adopted Sabrina. She is absolutely not your biological child." 50 elite guests heard every single syllable she screamed. To Victoria's minimal credit, she realized her catastrophic error almost instantly, clapping a hand over her mouth. But it was entirely too late. The radioactive information was already rapidly spreading through the room like a highly contagious virus. Did she just scream that Sabrina isn't even his biological daughter? He legally adopted her, but he has been treating her like absolute, subhuman garbage for decades. If she is not even his actual kid, why on earth was he so unrelentingly cruel to her? Arthur finally managed to find his voice. It was a raspy, broken sound. "Everyone, please, this is a highly private, internal family matter." Private? Aunt Margaret, my father's older, formidable sister, a terrifying woman in her mid-70s who had absolutely never, ever liked Victoria, suddenly rose aggressively from her seat. "You literally just stood up and proudly called that poor girl a worthless loser in front of 50 people. And now we all find out she isn't even your biological daughter. And you have the sheer audacity to demand this is private. Margaret, sit down right now." Arthur barked, desperately trying to regain control. "I absolutely will not sit down, Arthur." Margaret's voice was so incredibly sharp it could have easily sliced through the crystal glasses. "Margaret had always loved my mother. Margaret was exactly like a beloved daughter to me. I sat back and watched exactly how you maliciously, systematically abused her only child after she tragically died. We all sat here and watched it happen. We just never possessed the concrete, legal proof that your cruelty was so incredibly, calculatedly deliberate." The entire room violently erupted. Cousins began whispering furiously to one another. Wealthy business associates exchanged deeply uncomfortable, panicked glances. The professional photographer from the magazine, I would later learn, was frantically texting his senior editor demanding a massive change in the upcoming story. Arthur. It was Howard Chin, one of Arthur's oldest, most lucrative business partners. He slowly stood up from the table, his face a mask of visible, profound discomfort. "I strongly believe that perhaps I should be leaving right now." "Howard, do not be absolutely ridiculous," Arthur pleaded, panic finally setting in. "I explicitly invited you here to joyously celebrate my prestigious award, not to witness this." He gestured vaguely, helplessly at the complete chaos unfolding around him. "Whatever the hell this mess is, Arthur, I will formally contact your office next week," Howard said coldly. He immediately turned and left the room. Two other extremely prominent business associates silently stood up and followed him out the door. Julian was suddenly on his feet, frantically trying to deploy aggressive damage control. "Everyone, please, I beg you to calm down. My father is clearly incredibly upset and confused right now. Let's just all take a collective breath, Julian." Victoria's voice was absolutely icy, cutting him off. "Do not speak right now. Shut your mouth." But Julian kept frantically talking, and Victoria kept aggressively snapping at him, and Arthur kept desperately clutching the adoption papers in his fist as if they might magically burst into flames if he held them tightly enough. Meanwhile, the absolute truth kept rapidly spreading from table to table, and there was absolutely nothing any of them could physically do to stop the bleeding. What exactly happened next, I meticulously pieced together much later from Aunt Margaret's highly detailed, gleeful account. The grand dining room had rapidly descended into total chaos. It was a highly controlled, specific type of chaos, the exact kind that only occurs at incredibly wealthy gatherings where absolutely no one ever raises their voice above a harsh whisper, but everyone in the room is absolutely, fundamentally furious. Aunt Margaret proudly stood at the absolute epicenter of the storm, effortlessly commanding the attention of the room exactly the way only a 73-year-old, wealthy matriarch truly could. Let me make absolutely, perfectly sure I understand this grotesque situation correctly. Her voice effortlessly cut through the chaotic murmurs. Arthur, you willingly married Margaret fully knowing that she was heavily pregnant with another man's child. You legally adopted Sabrina as your own on paper. And then you spent 30 long years maliciously, systematically punishing that innocent little girl for circumstances that were completely beyond her control. Margaret, you have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Arthur stammered, sweating profusely. I know exactly what I am talking about, Arthur. She took a highly aggressive, threatening step closer to him. I was physically present at your wedding. I watched Margaret's face very closely when she recited her vows to you. She was absolutely not in love with you, Arthur. She was utterly terrified of you. And now, looking at these documents, I finally understand exactly why. Another older cousin chimed in from the back. It was Robert, a man who had spent his entire life seemingly worshipping the ground Arthur walked on. Is this actually the truth, Arthur? You knew this dark secret from the very beginning? This is absolutely none of your damn business, Robert. Arthur snarled defensively. It immediately became our business the second you made your humiliating public announcement tonight. Robert's voice was freezing cold. We all laughed at your cruel joke. I personally laughed out loud at a young woman who never ever did a single thing to deserve that kind of abuse. The entire mood in the massive room had shifted palpably and incredibly dangerously. These were not random strangers aggressively accusing Arthur. They were his own blood family, people who had quietly witnessed years of his subtle, insidious cruelty and had cowardly chosen to explain it away. People who were now horrifyingly realizing that they had been completely complicit in the abuse of a child. You aggressively made all of us an active part of your sick, twisted vendetta. Margaret continued relentlessly, not letting him breathe. Every single cruel joke made at Sabrina's expense. Every single dismissive, degrading comment. You maliciously wanted all of us to look down on her, and we blindly did exactly what you wanted, because we foolishly trusted your judgment. Arthur's face had completely transitioned from a pale gray to a highly mottled, dangerous shade of purple. I generously gave that ungrateful girl absolutely everything, he roared defensively. You gave her absolutely everything except basic, fundamental human decency. Margaret shouted back. The silence that immediately followed that statement was utterly deafening. And somewhere far across town, I was calmly pulling my car into the safety of my apartment parking lot, finally able to breathe deep into my lungs. According to Margaret, the absolute most devastating, crushing moments of the night came directly from Arthur's own children. Julian was the very first one to completely crack under the pressure. He had been nervously pacing back and forth behind his father's chair, desperately trying to manage the PR disaster when the full, crushing weight of the revelation finally, truly hit his brain. He stopped dead mid-stride, staring blankly at the adoption papers still tightly clutched in Arthur's shaking hand. Wait. His voice sounded incredibly strange, hollow and entirely broken. Wait, Dad. You knew this entire time? Julian, Arthur desperately reached out a hand for his golden sun. You knew. Julian took a violent step backward, physically recoiling from the touch. My entire life, you constantly told me that Sabrina was a massive disappointment, that she was aggressively failing to live up to the pristine Sterling family name, that I had to work 10 times harder just because her laziness was dragging our legacy down. Son, you have to understand, but she was never, ever actually a Sterling. Julian's voice completely broke on the word. She was just some random, innocent kid you arrogantly agreed to raise to secure a lucrative land deal. And you deliberately, systematically manipulated me into actively hating her for it. I didn't force you to do anything, Julian. You made your own choices. You absolutely did manipulate me. Julian's carefully constructed composure finally, spectacularly shattered into a million pieces. Every single time I ruthlessly mocked her, you laughed and praised me for it. Every single time I actively excluded her from the family, you offered me your glowing approval. I genuinely thought I was just being a loyal, good son. But I wasn't. I was just a vicious weapon you used to hurt her. Vanessa was openly crying now, thick, black mascara rapidly streaming down her carefully contoured cheeks. Mom. She slowly turned to face Victoria. Did you secretly know about this document the entire time? Victoria's stony, defensive silence was all the answer Vanessa needed. You constantly told me that Sabrina was deeply, bitterly jealous of us. That she viciously hated me because I possessed everything she secretly wanted. But she never, ever wanted anything from us except… Vanessa's voice broke into a loud sob. Except to just be a part of a family. Vanessa, darling, please, it is infinitely more complicated than no, it absolutely is not complicated at all. Vanessa violently pulled her arm away from Victoria's outstretched hand. It is really not complicated. You are both completely horrible, toxic people. And you maliciously raised me to be a horrible, toxic person too. She aggressively grabbed her designer purse from the table and practically sprinted toward the exit doors. Where exactly do you think you are going? Victoria shrieked after her. I am going to try and find my sister. The heavy oak door violently slammed shut behind her, leaving a silence so absolute, so complete in that massive room that you could literally hear the ice slowly melting inside the abandoned champagne glasses. But Aunt Margaret was absolutely not finished with him. I learned much later that she had been patiently waiting decades for this exact moment. Not out of pure malice, but out of a crushing, suffocating guilt that had never quite faded from her soul. She had intimately known Margaret. She had loved her exactly like a sister. And she had watched, completely helpless, as Arthur slowly, methodically crushed the radiant light out of her spirit. Since we are apparently laying all of the dark family secrets completely bare tonight, Margaret said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the devastated, silent room, let me personally add one more massive truth to the pile. Arthur's head snapped up violently. Margaret, do not you dare say another word. Margaret did not die in a tragic, random car accident. The entire room went completely, terrifyingly still. She lost control of her vehicle on a slick, rainy night. That part of the police report is entirely true. But do any of you actually know exactly why she was frantically driving her car at midnight in the middle of a massive thunderstorm? Arthur? No answer. Just heavy, panicked breathing. Because you explicitly told her you were going to aggressively send Sabrina away to a remote, abusive boarding school. You screamed at her that you simply could not stand the sight of looking at another man's child in your house. For one more second. Loud gasps violently rippled through the assembled crowd. Margaret was frantically driving her car to my house. She was driving to beg me to take Sabrina in and protect her. She was finally going to permanently leave you. Finally, after years of your horrific threats and financial manipulation, she had finally had enough of your abuse. You absolutely do not have any proof of that? Arthur roared defensively. I know it for an absolute fact because she Frantically called my phone that exact night. Margaret's voice violently trembled with suppressed rage. She was crying so incredibly hard I could barely understand her words. She screamed into the phone, "Margaret, he is going to physically take my baby away from me. I absolutely cannot let him do it. I would rather die than let him hurt her anymore." The entire dining room was completely frozen in horror. And then her car violently went off the slick road into the ravine. Margaret aggressively wiped tears from her eyes. She absolutely did not randomly lose control of that car. Arthur. She completely lost hope. Arthur looked exactly as if he had been physically struck by a heavy baseball bat. Margaret spent 8 agonizing years trapped in a loveless, freezing marriage, desperately trying to protect a daughter you absolutely never wanted. She was only 29 years old when she died, and the absolute last words she ever spoke to anyone on this earth were entirely about keeping Sabrina safe. That is incredibly unfair to blame me for an accident. Arthur stammered. Fair. Margaret's voice violently rose in volume for the very first time all evening. You actually have the audacity to talk about what is fair. That innocent little girl grew up entirely motherless, trapped inside a massive house completely full of adults who deeply resented her very existence. You absolutely do not get to use the word fair. Arthur opened his mouth to aggressively argue back, but absolutely no sound came out. For the very first time in his entire arrogant life, Arthur Sterling had absolutely nothing to say. The catastrophic aftermath of Aunt Margaret's explosive revelation was unlike anything the Sterling family had ever witnessed in its history. Julian, who had spent his entire adult life aggressively modeling his entire personality after Arthur, looked exactly like a man watching his entire identity crumble into ash. He sank heavily into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I publicly called her a pathetic charity case. The words came out broken, barely audible over the silence. At Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, right in front of everyone, I explicitly said, well, at least we all know exactly one person sitting at this table definitely didn't earn their place here. Every single person laughed at her. Sabrina just smiled that sad smile, like she was completely used to the abuse. He slowly looked up, hot tears rapidly streaming down his face. She was completely used to the abuse because I maliciously did it to her all the time. Because you deliberately made me think it was an acceptable way to behave. Arthur said absolutely nothing. I am 35 years old, Julian's voice cracked violently. And I have been a vicious, cruel bully my entire adult life. To my own sister, who wasn't even technically my biological sister. Who never, ever did a single malicious thing to me except quietly exist in the same house. Julian, you couldn't possibly have known the truth. Victoria attempted to soothe him. I didn't want to know the truth. He stood up abruptly, his chair violently scraping against the marble floor. I absolutely didn't ask any difficult questions because the honest answers might have made me slightly uncomfortable. That is absolutely not ignorance, Dad. That is pure, pathetic cowardice. He aggressively turned to face Victoria, who had been standing completely frozen in shock. Her perfect, aristocratic composure had finally entirely cracked. And you meticulously orchestrated this entire environment. You constantly told me Sabrina was completely beneath our status. You actively coached me on exactly what cruel things to say to make her feel as small as possible. I was fiercely protecting this family's legacy. Victoria shot back defensively. You were fiercely protecting your own massive inheritance. Julian's pure disgust was palpable in the air. This was never, ever about protecting a family. This was entirely about hoarding money. It has always been entirely about money with you. He looked directly at his father one last, devastating time. I honestly have absolutely no idea who I even am anymore. But I know with absolute certainty that I do not want to be anything like you. Julian turned and walked completely out of the dining room without saying another word. And Arthur, for the very first time anyone in that room could remember, looked truly, utterly, profoundly alone. Arthur made one final, desperate attempt to miraculously salvage the disastrous evening. He nervously straightened his expensive Brioni jacket, quickly smoothed his silver hair, and desperately tried to summon the commanding, terrifying presence that had successfully built a real estate empire and intimidated corporate boardrooms for 40 years. Everyone, his voice was attempting to be firm and highly controlled. This is obviously a very complex, private family matter. I deeply appreciate all of your concern, but I must strongly ask that you respect our privacy at this time. Let us please conclude the evening's festivities here, and I will adequately address all of these wild allegations at an appropriate time. Absolutely no one in the room moved an inch. I said, the evening is officially over, Arthur repeated, his voice wavering slightly. Arthur. It was Howard Chen's booming voice coming loudly through the speakerphone that his assistant had accidentally left resting on the table. He must have been quietly listening to the entire meltdown from his car. I am officially, permanently withdrawing all my capital from the Meridian project. My corporate attorneys will contact your office first thing Monday morning. Howard, please, be reasonable about this. I just sat there and watched you call your own daughter, adopted or biological, it doesn't matter, a complete loser in front of 50 people. Howard shouted through the phone. And then I sit here and learn that you have been systematically, psychologically abusing her for 30 years. What exactly is reasonable about me continuing to do multi-million-dollar business with a monster like you? The phone line went dead with a loud click. Before Arthur could even formulate a response, 2 more cell phones in the room buzzed loudly. Text messages. Urgent. Emails. The corporate dominoes were rapidly falling. Mr. Sterling. The Forbes photographer slowly stepped forward, looking visibly uncomfortable but determined. I strongly believe you should know. My senior editor just texted me and asked me to completely pivot the angle of the article. We will be reaching out to your PR team for an official comment regarding this incident before publication. Arthur's face instantly went the color of wet ash. Get out, his voice was barely a raspy whisper. All of you, get the hell out of my house. Slowly, the remaining 50 guests began to silently disperse. They did not leave with the satisfied, happy air of people who had just attended a lavish celebration. They left with the deeply shell-shocked, horrified expressions of people who had just witnessed a fatal train derailment. Aunt Margaret lingered at the heavy oak door for a moment. She looked back at Arthur one final time. Margaret inherently deserved so much better than you, she said quietly. And so did Sabrina. Then she turned and was gone. And Arthur Sterling stood completely alone in his ruined, extravagant dining room, entirely surrounded by shattered crystal glass, spilled red wine, and the total, absolute wreckage of a flawless reputation built entirely on a foundation of lies. You know, sitting here now, recording this, I realized something incredibly important. I did not aggressively destroy my father. I did not actively bring down his massive empire, or maliciously steal his money, or actively ruin his marriage. I simply stood up and told the absolute truth. The truth has a very funny, ruthless way of handling all the rest of the destruction for you. If you have ever been trapped in a horrific situation where you had to agonizingly choose between keeping the peace and speaking your truth, I see you. I intimately know exactly how hard that choice is to make. And I know that sometimes the absolute bravest thing you can possibly do is to simply stop pretending. What exactly happened after that explosive night? Did I ever see Arthur again? Did I ever forgive Victoria? Stay with me. We are almost at the very end of the journey. While the massive Sterling estate completely imploded upon itself, I was quietly driving home in total silence. No radio playing, no podcasts. Just the steady, comforting hum of my car engine and the rhythmic sound of my own deep breathing. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a very modest, unassuming building in the city. It was absolutely nothing flashy or expensive, but it was entirely mine. I sat in the dark parking lot for a very long time. My cell phone violently buzzed. A text message from Arthur. "How absolutely dare you? Call me back immediately." Another text message from Julian. "Sabrina, please. We desperately need to sit down and talk." A text message from Victoria. "You have maliciously destroyed this entire family. I sincerely hope you are happy with yourself." And then, finally, a quiet text message from Aunt Beatrice. "Margaret just called my phone. She told me absolutely everything that happened. I am so incredibly, fiercely proud of you, my sweet girl." I immediately deleted the first 3 toxic messages without even considering a response. But Beatrice's message, that one I permanently saved. I walked inside my apartment, went straight to my wooden dresser, and gently picked up the photograph of my mother. "It is finally over, Mama." My voice came out significantly steadier than I had expected. "I am finally free." I knew with absolute certainty there would be massive fallout. Intense legal complications, perhaps. Furious, threatening phone calls, undeniably. The Sterlings were absolutely not the type of people to accept public humiliation quietly. But in that exact moment, none of it mattered to me. My cell phone rang. Again. Arthur's number. I let it go directly to voicemail. Then Julian's number. Sent to voicemail. Then a number I didn't immediately recognize flashed on the screen. I cautiously answered that one. "Sabrina?" It was Vanessa. Her voice was incredibly thick with heavy tears. "I know you probably absolutely do not want to speak to me right now, but I had to call and say that I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry." I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed tightly to my ear. "Where exactly are you right now?" "I am sitting in my car, parked directly outside your apartment building." A long, heavy pause followed. "I know you desperately need space. I know I absolutely do not deserve a single ounce of your time or forgiveness. But if there is ever a tiny chance, if you are ever willing to, just talk to me." I slowly walked over and looked out my bedroom window. Sure enough, a bright white luxury SUV was parked idling across the street in the dark. "Come upstairs, Vanessa." It was absolutely not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a fragile, tiny start. Exactly 1 week later, the massive consequences became incredibly concrete. The highly anticipated Forbes article absolutely never mentioned Arthur's prestigious award. Instead, it ran a devastating, in-depth expose titled, "The Sterling Family's Carefully Constructed Empire Shatters at Founders' Day Celebration." The explicit details were incredibly damning, but factually accurate. The explosive public humiliation, the DNA test revelation, the subsequent rapid exodus of key business partners. Howard Chin officially and permanently withdrew his massive capital from the Meridian Project, a $70 million commercial development that had been Arthur's absolute crown jewel. 2 other major partners rapidly followed suit within days, aggressively citing deep concerns about erratic corporate leadership. Victoria formally filed for a legal separation, not because she had suddenly, miraculously developed a moral conscience, but because, as Julian bitterly explained to me later, she acutely knew the massive influx of money was about to rapidly dry up, and she desperately wanted to legally secure her financial share before the ship completely sank. Julian formally resigned from his position as Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Global Holdings. His official resignation letter, which somehow mysteriously leaked to the local business journal, contained one single, powerful sentence. "I desperately need to learn exactly who I am when I am not actively trying to become my father. And what about me?" I simply went back to my job. I diligently graded my students' papers. I passionately coached nervous high school seniors through their complex college applications. I ate my lunch with Marcus in the small teacher's lounge, and we talked enthusiastically about absolutely everything, except the Sterling family drama. But things had undeniably changed. My cousin, Robert, the exact same man who had laughed at Arthur's cruel loser joke, sent me a massive, expensive bouquet of flowers with a handwritten card that simply said, "I am so incredibly sorry." Aunt Margaret called my phone every few days, just to check in on me, happily sharing dramatic family updates I hadn't explicitly asked for, but secretly appreciated hearing anyway. And Vanessa? Vanessa called me every single day. "Can we please get coffee together?" she asked on the 7th day. "Not at a fancy restaurant your family owns," I stipulated. "There is a cheap, greasy diner right near my apartment. Nothing fancy. Just basic coffee." I hesitated for a moment. Just a week ago, I would have immediately said absolutely not. But something fundamental had shifted inside me, too. I was absolutely no longer the terrified woman who constantly flinched at the threat of Sterling judgment. "Fine," I agreed. "But I am paying the bill." "Deal," she replied eagerly. It was absolutely not a magical reconciliation. Not yet. But it was definitely something new. The cheap diner Vanessa surprisingly agreed to was exactly what I promised. Nothing fancy. Formica tables, cracked vinyl booths, and a tired waitress who called everyone Han and refilled the black coffee without needing to be asked. It was the exact kind of establishment Victoria would rather die than set foot inside, which is probably exactly why Vanessa agreed to it. She was already sitting there when I walked in, hunched anxiously over a chipped mug of black coffee as if it were a physical lifeline, completely stripped of her usual designer armor, no expensive handbag, no flawless makeup, no perfectly styled hair. She looked incredibly young and incredibly small. "Hey," I said quietly, sliding into the sticky vinyl booth directly across from her. "Hey," she replied, completely unable to meet my eyes. "Thank you so much for actually coming." We sat in incredibly awkward silence for a long moment, the loud clatter of cheap dishes and the murmur of other diner conversations filling the heavy space between us. Finally, Vanessa took a deep breath and spoke. "I have been obsessively replaying every single conversation we have ever had in my head. Every single time I intentionally made you feel like you weren't good enough. Every single time I actively compared myself to you and maliciously made sure you knew I thought I was winning the game." "Vanessa, no, please, let me finish." She finally looked up, her eyes completely red and swollen. I was 27 years old before I finally realized I had never actually had a real relationship with my own sister. I just had a vicious, endless competition. And I didn't even know what the hell the grand prize was that I was desperately competing for. Neither did I admitted softly. I genuinely thought if I just tried hard enough, eventually I would finally be considered a real part of the family. "You were always a real part of the family, Sabrina. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "We were all entirely too busy performing for his approval to actually notice." I slowly stirred my black coffee, processing her confession. "Can we possibly start completely over?" Vanessa asked, her voice incredibly small and fragile. No, I absolutely do not deserve it. I know you might never, ever truly trust me again. But can we just try?" I thought deeply about my mother. I thought about the concept of chosen family, about the massive difference between sharing blood and actually belonging to someone. We absolutely cannot erase 27 years of profound damage with one cup of coffee, I said finally. But we can certainly start somewhere. Vanessa rapidly nodded her head, thick tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I slowly reached across the sticky table and gently squeezed her trembling hand. It was not absolute forgiveness, but it was a heavy door, slowly cracking open in the dark. And sometimes, that is more than enough. 1 month after the explosive Founders Day disaster, I quietly drove to a peaceful cemetery nestled deep in the mountains. Aunt Beatrice rode in the passenger seat. We walked together in silence through the long rows of ancient granite headstones until we reached a very modest, simple marker resting peacefully beneath a massive, ancient oak tree. The weathered stone simply read, Margaret Grace Thorne, beloved mother and sister, 1968 to 2001. You are more than enough, exactly as you are. I had personally chosen that specific inscription myself when I was finally old enough to legally have a voice in the matter. At the time, I honestly didn't know exactly why those specific words felt so incredibly, vitally important to carve into stone. Now, I completely understood the gravity of them. I slowly knelt down in the damp, morning grass and gently placed a massive, vibrant bouquet of bright yellow sunflowers directly against the cold stone. They were her absolute favorite, Beatrice had told me years ago. Hey, Mama, my voice was barely above a fragile whisper. I finally found your secret letter. I know absolutely everything now. The cool autumn wind gently rustled through the massive oak leaves high above us. I spent 32 agonizing years desperately trying to earn basic love from a man who was absolutely never going to give it to me. But you already knew that, didn't you? You desperately tried to protect me from the monster, and you are miraculously still protecting me, even now. Beatrice gently placed a warm, steady hand on my shaking shoulder. I am absolutely not a sterling, I continued, wiping a tear from my cheek. I never, ever was. But I am your daughter. I am Margaret Thorne's daughter. And that is more than enough for me. I slowly stood back up, brushing the damp grass from my knees. I am going to be perfectly okay, Mama. For the very first time in my entire life, I actually genuinely believe that. We stayed at the gravesite for a long while. Beatrice warmly shared beautiful, hilarious stories about Margaret as a vibrant young woman. Her infectious laughter, her incredible, infuriating stubbornness, her fierce, consuming love for old books and bright flowers, and the beautiful daughter she had barely gotten the chance to raise. When we finally turned and walked back to the car, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced in decades. Absolute, profound peace. Not the magical absence of all pain. The deep scars were undeniably still there, and they might always ache when it rains. But resting firmly beneath the pain now was a solid, unbreakable foundation of truth. I finally knew exactly who I was. I finally knew exactly where I came from. And I finally, completely knew that my inherent worth had never, ever depended on Arthur Sterling's toxic approval. Are you going to be okay? Beatrice asked gently as we slowly pulled out of the cemetery gates. I looked over at her and smiled. The very first real, unburdened smile I had felt in a very long time. Yeah, I said softly. I think I finally am. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to my story. If you have ever felt completely invisible inside your own family structure, if you have ever worked yourself to the point of absolute exhaustion desperately trying to earn conditional love that was never actually on the table, I want you to desperately know something. Your inherent worth is absolutely not determined by broken people who aggressively refuse to see your light. Sometimes the absolute bravest, most powerful thing you can possibly do is simply walk away from the table. And sometimes walking away is just the very first beautiful step toward finally walking toward yourself. If this narrative touched your soul, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And check the description box below for more empowering stories exactly like this one. Stories of resilient people who finally, bravely found their voice when they genuinely thought they had lost it in the dark forever. Until we meet again, please take incredibly good care of yourselves. And always remember, you are more than enough exactly as you are.